I'm a writer and a health and social care commissioner and formerly a frontline support worker from Reading in the south of England. And as Chris said, I'm here to talk about Tulips, which is a radio drama that's currently available on YouTube and all the major podcasting platforms for free. So this isn't a sales pitch in any way. So I'm planning to talk to you for about 20 minutes about the play's background, its purpose, and how it could potentially be useful to you. During which time I'm planning to play a few segments of the play, assuming the technical side of things works okay. And as Chris said, after that, we can open things up for discussion. Now, Tulips is built around a single question, which is, in 2020, record numbers of people asked, "Am I being abused?" But how many of them were men? And it poses a hypothetical scenario to the audience, which is, if they could hear a couple fighting, but they couldn't see who was raising their fists, how would they work out who was in danger? An argument, for example, like the ones that new couple Alex and Scarlett are having in this segment of the play, which I'm about to play to you.
That was all we knew about their first meeting, based on Alex's version of events at least. Oh, there were some concerning signs, but they went unnoticed by most people, until the neighbours started reporting loud arguments a year later.
I don't want you having a go at me again!
Look, I wasn't having a go, but we're not even having sex anymore!
And why could that be? Look at me! I'm too anxious to eat. My friends barely recognise me.
That is not my fault. I am just not comfortable with you seeing him.
It was one drink with a friend! I don't have time for this rubbish.
Which got worse as summer turned into autumn.
Look, you're overreacting. I'm not the one with the problem here.
Don't try to make this about me. Is that what you call being a good person?
Look, I didn't do anything wrong.
Why is our dinner up the wall?
Until finally, in December 2016...
Jesus Christ! Do you expect me to be okay with this? Oh, God, the neighbours again. Do you have any idea what this is going to do to my reputation?
I'll make an excuse. I'll tell them I knocked something over, but only if you promise to be good. Please, just promise you won't do that to me again.
So that's the dilemma facing the main character, Christine, who you just heard narrating the scene. Now, she's been given permission to open her domestic abuse service, the Tulip Project, up to men. But none of her friends can understand why, as she's an abuse survivor herself who's only ever had bad experiences of men. And when footballer Jason and businessman Alex, who we just heard, are referred to her, she and the audience have to decide whether she should be supporting them as perpetrators or as victims, which is made doubly hard by their reluctance to discuss their experiences and their limited understanding of what domestic abuse can really mean. Now, spoilers, they turn out to be victims, not perpetrators. But one of the huge struggles they have is finding anyone except Christine who believes them. Plus, they really don't like identifying as victims. Now, this is something that Alex and Jason discuss when they first meet at the Tulip Project, which is the next segment of the play that I'm going to play to you. Once I've found the section.
Been any physical violence. That's still true, is it?
I swore I wouldn't let it get this far.
So why didn't you come back sooner?
Because I don't want to lose her. She loves me.
Then why are you sitting a support service for battered men? And why ain't she sitting a perpetrator program, eh? Look, it's okay, mate. No one's judging you for it. It's just me here. And I'm hardly likely to after what I took from Tessa. But you've got to be honest with me. Come on, tell me. How long has she been making you her victim?
No, please don't say it.
Look, it's about time you stopped fighting that word and just accepted it. It's about time we both did. How long has she been making you her
For
victim?
over a year. God, listen to me, I'm a joke.
No, Oh, I don't care how much you've heard that, you're not.
I am. I'm a grown man, a man. I'm being abused by a woman and no one believes me. They were supposed to be my friends. How could anyone think I would hurt her?
Because they haven't heard the full story. Only the part someone chose to tell them. That's enough to make most people's minds up. Especially if she seems normal and charming to them. Gets so you lose sight of what's acceptable anymore. I thought I deserved everything Tessa gave me first time I come here. Well, I upset her by going out on the lash. You know, all the excuses you end up making. It's one reason I never fought it when I were in court. I mean, how often do you hear a DV case on the news that's about a bloke? You only ever see the twats that hit women. I figured the judge would see a woman crying and arguing with someone like me, footballer. Who are they going to assume was in the wrong?
You're a football player.
Well, Sunday League nowadays. Why?
The service is called the Tulip Project.
Oh, stupid name. But Christine reckons no bloke could be seen dead walking through a door with abuse written on it. As if this is better. But my mates take the piss, call me Petal. Makes you feel like a bloody pansy. I kept telling her we might be victims, but we're men too.
So after Jason and Alex admit to being victims, they both face a choice. What do they want to do? Will they stay at the service and seek help with leaving their relationships? Or will they stay in the relationships? And that dilemma, which is at the heart of the play and at the heart of every abusive relationship, was inspired by a real event that was related to me by someone who used to work in a hospital. And she told me that many, many years ago, she was working in the A&E department, and a guy had come in that was in a very bad way. And when she was triaging him, he revealed that he had been assaulted by his partner, his female partner. So she had patched him up and she had looked for details of a service that she could refer him onto that could help with domestic abuse. And the only service that she could find locally was a service called the Tulip service. And she said that after she discharged him, she always wondered whether or not he attended or whether or not the branding of the service would have deterred him from going along. And that made me curious. So in the course of my work, I'd met and supported lots of female domestic abuse victims, but I hadn't really met any men. So I was wondering, could this be something that really happens to a man? And how, when common wisdom says that a man could easily overpower a woman or leave the relationship? And it also seemed like a controversial line of thought, because as a commissioner, I knew all too well that there's very limited funding for domestic abuse anyway. Services for women definitely aren't funded to the level that they need to be. So does discussing this concept or thinking about it put that or run the risk of putting that funding in jeopardy? Likewise, if there are lots of male victims, how is it possible to direct them to services that are aimed at and branded for women, particularly when those services ideally need to be based in environments that are relatively free of men? So I started exploring the subject. So I started researching the different services that existed, the ways that they offered services, who they offered services to. I spoke to quite a few academics that had studied and researched domestic abuse, and I spoke to lots of male and female victims. And there were three major things that I discovered, particularly from speaking with male abuse victims. The first was that men very rarely identified their experiences as abusive. That just wasn't a label that they would apply to what they were talking about, even though what they were talking about ticked all the boxes in terms of the definitions of abuse. Secondly, when they discussed what happened to them with other people, beyond myself, they were very frequently disbelieved. And lastly, and I think this was the biggest thing for me, pretty much all of the male abuse victims that I spoke to didn't conform to, I think, the stereotype most people would have of them. They weren't weak, spineless, weedy guys. Generally speaking, I would say they tended to embody a lot of the things you would think of when you think of alpha males or protective males. And I found all of this, I have to say, profoundly affecting, because essentially what I was discovering was that the majority of these guys had experienced a double crime. There'd been the abuse itself, but then there'd also been a sort of secondary crime or a moral crime around the lack of support that they had and the disbelief they were coming up against. Now, alongside my career in social care, I'd also been writing for the stage. And I, as you would have guessed from the fact that my face is plastered all over the poster, I also do some acting as well. And I thought this would make for a really striking play. It was a really original topic that hadn't been covered in depth before in mainstream media. And that meant that I had an opportunity to give a voice to people who I felt had never really had one before. And I thought that also by writing about the character of Christine, who you heard earlier, the woman that runs the service, I thought it was an opportunity to reinforce and strengthen the message that domestic abuse is also a huge problem for a huge amount of women, albeit one that I would say is still very poorly understood by the general public, who all too often tend to dismiss it if the abuse isn't physical, or ask the classic question that every single abuse victim I spoke to said that they faced at some point, which is, why did you stay if it was really that bad? But I didn't just want to write it. I wanted to make sure that it got performed and that lots of people had an opportunity to hear it. So this is a couple of years ago now. My friends and I applied for Arts Council funding so that we could mount it as a stage play and then tour it. And the Arts Council awarded us funding because they, like me, wanted to demystify those same questions I originally had when I first heard my friend's story of what had happened in that hospital. Namely, is this something that can really happen to that many men? How can a man be abused when he could theoretically leave the relationship or fight back? How does a man's masculinity shape their response to abuse and their willingness to seek and engage in support? What kind of men get abused? And lastly, if we have a classic view of what a male abuser looks like, what does a female abuser look like, especially when domestic abuse is often tied in the public consciousness to male power? Now, that last question is something we explored through the character of Scarlett, Alex's girlfriend, again, who you heard earlier. And you can see a part of the answer to that last question in the extract I'm about to play you, which shows what happens when Alex tries to set some boundaries for their relationship.
If we're going to have a proper relationship, things need to work both ways. Don't you understand that? Or they won't work at all.
I did what you asked. I told our friends everything.
And?
They said we'd both done things that could be considered wrong. All those times you told me I wasn't allowed to do things.
No, I never said you're not allowed to do anything. I said I'm not comfortable with it. And if you recall, you said you didn't have time for that rubbish.
Sorry, I make myself laugh sometimes.
Didn't you read those leaflets about abuse? But don't you recognise what you're doing?
You tried to dump me before Christmas. On the anniversary of my mum's death. Do you know what that did to me?
Look, I'm not denying I handled some things badly, but
And what
you
about
can't...
this? I'm not comfortable with you hanging out with men who fancy you. Why should I cut people out of my life?
Because you keep telling me how much you want them.
You're taking out of context. I only said that because you'd upset me. But fine, I'll isolate myself if it makes you happy. Even if you won't do the same for me. You have to be okay with me seeing Claire. Claire, who, for some reason, I don't trust you with. Speak of the devil, it's her, isn't it?
No, it's just a bill from 3.
Why would you put your phone face down if there was nothing to hide?
Look, I only came to that stupid party because she wanted to introduce us.
You came because of her. You said so. If you want to keep that friendship in your life, then fine. But you need to include me when you see her.
That's not quite what I had in...
Things need to work both ways. I said I'm fine with you seeing her, so now you compromise. Show me I can trust you.
Okay, but only if you agree...
You agree to understand abusive behaviour and attend a perpetrator programme? No.
I'm not willing to compromise on...
My exes said the same thing before they left me, and it crippled me. The shame and stigma of thinking that label could be applied to me. Why do you think I was so messed up when I met you?
Well, it sounds like you were as bad to them as your stepdad was to you.
I can't be with someone who thinks I'm anything like him. I'll get counselling, if you want, but only couples counselling, so they can help both of us.
Look, I need time to think. I should really go and... I'll go get a drink.
So we mounted the original stage play in spring of 2019. And then across the summer and autumn of that year, we toured it in areas of the country where the rates of domestic abuse were higher than the national average. And the reception, generally speaking, was really good. We found that some guys came from a long way away to see it because there was nothing else out there that was really telling their stories. And listening to their feedback, it became really clear that they'd previously struggled to talk about their experiences. And because of that, that had sort of ruled out their ability to seek out and find any kind of support. But they said that the play had given them a chance to basically say to their families or their friends, look, something like this happened to me, without having to directly talk about their own experiences. And that then became a conversation starter for something that they might otherwise never have shared. In fact, one guy brought his daughter to watch it for that very reason. And he told me afterwards that they were able to have a really in-depth conversation about abuse on the journey home, in which she then shared with him the fact that she too had been abused. And for other guys, I found out that it represented a way for them to understand what abuse is. So the cycle of abuse, the patterns that they've lived through or experienced, and to start processing their own experiences and to move on from them. In fact, several guys who have been abused, in some cases decades ago, said that this was the first time that they were able to actually make sense of and start moving past their past. And on a side note, the reviews and the feedback from the general public was pretty good too. And we got lots of press on the radio and television, plus the feedback from frontline services who came to see it was really positive. So that's the background to the play. And chronologically, that kind of brings us up to the point where the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, there was, as I'm sure you all know, a very big rise in domestic abuse rates across the country. And we decided that putting out a free audio version of the play using the remainder of our Arts Council funding might be a helpful way to respond to the increased levels of domestic abuse, but also to bring the play to areas of the country and people that we hadn't been able to visit when we'd done our original tour. So after we adapted the story for radio and recorded it, we partnered with a couple of domestic abuse services that support men as well as women. We wrapped their contact details into the end of the play, and through some careful marketing, we're trying to realise our new aims, which is to give the public and professionals a tool that improves their ability to detect abuse, to give the public and professionals a vehicle for signposting victims to support, to give victims a way to tell other people that they've been abused without actually having to talk about what's happened to them, and to give victims a way to get help, to understand the cycle of abuse, the behavioural patterns they're playing into and how to break out of them, again, without having to talk about what happened to them. Now, I'll play you one last segment of the play because a lot of men have said that this particular section really delivers for them, that last aim. And in this segment of the play, Alex, for the first time, is describing his relationship with Scarlett to Jason and talking about why he stays with her.
Someone screwed her over. She has abandonment issues and bad days. Can't you understand why?
Of course I understood. That's why I stayed. Isn't that what love is? Understanding why people say or do things they don't mean in the heat of the moment?
You're understanding why someone does something don't make it okay for them to do it. You're missing my point. She's conditioning you to make you think it's wrong to leave her.
That is not what she's doing.
And wrong to judge her for being unnaturally jealous, right? Tell me I'm wrong.
I thought I was going crazy at first. I could never understand why my computer was on when I thought I'd switched it off. Then I realised it only happened after she'd been alone in the flat, waiting for me to come home. Being bad. That's what she accuses me of if she finds out I've spoken to someone I shouldn't have, if I'm not a good person. She smashed up my kitchen the last time I met my friend Claire for a coffee. That's when the neighbours started taking an interest.
Oh, she loves me.
Look, she apologised afterwards. If I speak to other women, it triggers her abandonment issues, so I didn't want to stop talking to them, but...
But it's the only way you'll be treated nice. Sex, for instance, only happens when you promise to do what she wants. Like a dog being given a treat.
Oh, jealous is flattering if you think about it. I mean, she could have anyone she wants.
How do you know that?
Because she tells me. Oh no, don't laugh. It's not what you think. We always tell each other if someone's made a pass at us. That's the only way you can.
That's the only
really
way that
keep
she can keep tabs on you. Or show you she's got other options if you make her unhappy. Must make you really jealous.
She invites them when we go out, flirts with them in front of me, letting her hair down. I told her I was uncomfortable with it, but she said I was being unfair.
Convincing you you're the one who needs help. Third stage of the trick, the con. You bet everything you've got, but you've lost sight of your card and you can't back out without causing a scene, even though you know you're being had. And she's trained you so well that you just let it happen.
No, I told you it's not a question of choice. Look, I can't put my foot down again or she'll kill herself.
Though somehow they never end up being actual attempts, do they? Just enough to scare you into doing what she wants whenever you ask her to change.
But she does change when she sees how upset it makes me. She's a good person again for a few days.
It's just to stop you leaving. Last part of the trick. Have another go. It'll be different this time. Then before you know it, it's happening a second time, a third, a fourth. A real apology means the thing you're saying sorry for don't happen again. You'd know that if she actually valued you.
She does. That's why she doesn't want me to leave.
No, it's because you just accept everything she's doing like a mug. That ain't a real relationship. Don't you think you're worth one?
And it's worth noting that everything in the play is drawn from real life experiences. Now, it's not my story. Alex isn't meant to be me, but everything in the play actually happened to people. And the justifications that Alex made in that scene and Scarlett's words and behaviours are all things that people have said and done. So bringing things closer to the end, if you were to use the radio play in your work, who could benefit from it? Well, firstly, we found that services themselves have found it really beneficial. So far, 17 domestic violence services in the UK and America have said that it's helped their work. And overall, 50 health and social care services have given really positive feedback about it and its usefulness. Not just because it explores domestic abuse against men, but also because it demystifies and raises awareness of the different types of abuse in general and the reasons that people stay in abusive relationships. And the ways that services have been using it, for example, have included posting links to it on social media so that their followers can discover and access it privately, emailing links to the play out to their subscribers or in their newsletters, and or sometimes playing some or all of it to existing groups that they're already running. Sometimes under the banner of, we're bringing this to your attention just in case you know of anyone who might benefit from listening to it. Men who are experiencing abuse also, I would say, have benefited enormously from this and could stand to do so in the future. And there's a lot of them out there. Based on the police and crime reporting statistics from 2017, which is one of the most recent comprehensive data sets, there were about 700,000 men who reported experiences of domestic abuse, although it's estimated that that only represents about 20% of the overall number of male abuse victims, and that the other 80% didn't report it. Lastly, I would say that women stand to benefit a lot from the play as well, which is a strange answer, but I think it's true. And there's several reasons for that. One of the main things we explore in the play when we look at the character of Christine is that she set up the service because she suffered abuse from her father, but her father was abused as a young man, but because he was never supported, he grew up believing that this was how you treat people. So from my perspective, looking at providing support to men and the children of men who are experiencing abuse is a way of breaking that cycle of abuse and stopping those children, or minimizing the risk that those children or those men might then go on to abuse women in turn. Likewise, I would say, and this was definitely something I found during my research, lots of women experience abuse from other women as well. And if the domestic abuse support offer is lacking and not at the level it should be for heterosexual women in straight relationships and almost non-existent for men, I dread to think how patchy it is for gay women or women who experience it from their family members. And yet it is definitely something that they experience as well. Just try Googling podcasts or books about narcissism and coercively controlling mothers. You'll find that you get an awful lot of search results. The behaviours are identical, but the label is different and the support just isn't there for them. And a lot of women that I've spoken to have said that the play's been a way for them to recognise and start to get help for the behaviours that they've experienced. Lastly, I would say that it's also a really good way to try and challenge some of the stereotypes people have of women. And a huge amount of the male victims that I spoke to and their friends dismissed the warning signs and the red flags of abuse because they just wrote off jealousy, possessiveness, and controlling behavior as things women do. Likewise, I think there's a perception that women are too weak to challenge a man, which I think personally stems from the same perceptions that might have contributed to the gender pay gap. And lastly, I would say a significant proportion of my research came from just being out and about on a work night out and mentioning that I was working on this project. And I would say that 50 to 75% of the people that I spoke to mentioned that they had a friend or a family member in a difficult situation. They didn't always say in an abusive relationship, and said that they didn't know what to do for them. So I would say the general public also stands to benefit from the play, because it not only gives them a tool they can pass on to people that they're worried about, it also helps to make them themselves aware of the fact that abuse doesn't have to involve violence, and that coercive control is also a type of abuse and is also illegal. And that's really a big part of our plans for the future. And we want to make as much of the public aware of it as possible so we can raise awareness. We want to make as many frontline services aware of the radio play as possible. So again, that they've got the opportunity to use it either as a training tool for staff or as something that they can pass on to people that they're working with. And lastly, we also offer very brief theatre and education performance-led discussions for services and schools. And we want to keep pushing that angle so that we can directly engage people and lead conversations. So if any of you are interested in using it or know of any other services that might be interested in using it, please let me know. I can supply my email address before we wrap up today, and we can happily work with you to make that happen. So that's me. If anyone's got any questions, I'm quite happy to take them. Alternatively, because I know it's possibly difficult to ask questions about a radio play you haven't heard in its entirety, I did have a couple of sort of general questions or discussion points as well, but happy to proceed however Kathy and Chris want to go.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Michael. A really interesting and important play and piece of work. I think obviously really going through a lot of the background, how this came about, and who it benefits, and how it benefits people and services and so on. So yeah, just going on from what Michael said, does anybody have any questions they would like to ask Michael about the play or any other aspect of what Michael was talking about at all? Okay, in the comments section, Mary Cunningham from Action from Children has said that I think it's a shame that documentaries you see on TV generally only show the male as the perpetrator and not enough is shown around females, as this just feeds people thinking this is stereotypical. So probably Mary's point kind of reflected in your initial thinking process in terms of why this was something worth looking into. Is Mary's point? I think it's something that resonates with you, Michael, in terms of the work that you've been doing with the Tulip project.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really tricky one because I can totally understand why the narrative has been so focused on women. And I think one of the major challenges we had with the play is that every time we came to the verge of releasing an iteration of it, whether it was the stage play or the tour that we did or the radio play, it generally coincided with a point where a really horrific crime against a woman or women in general was featured on the news. So whether it was, the Sarah Everard thing, the point where the Me Too scandal kind of broke, the verdict in the Johnny Depp Amber Heard abuse case, it always coincided. So we always sort of had this ethical challenge as to, is now the best time to be talking about this? Should the discussion not be more about women? And where I kind of landed on that, and I think what's at the root of the issue is that I wouldn't dispute for a moment that there are an awful lot of tossers amongst men and that they've done some truly horrific things. I think the mistake people make is assuming that the guys that experience abuse are part of that group, and they're not. And that's fundamentally why we ended up going ahead and pushing the play during those circumstances, because from my perspective, we're talking about two very different demographics. But you can't argue against the fact that so many women experience this or other shitty behaviour from men. So I'm not remotely surprised that the narrative is focused on women, because so many of them do experience it. And as I said, there is support out there for women, but I'm under no illusions that that it's at the level it needs to be, because it most definitely isn't. And I know that from commissioning it myself. I think one of the other reasons for it as well is that, I need to be careful how I phrase this, I think it's difficult to talk about domestic abuse against men without it sounding like you're advocating for men's rights. And there's a subtle but important distinction between the two, not least because a lot of the people that advocate for men's rights also kind of stray into misogyny, I would say, and anti-feminism. So I think it's a really thorny topic for a lot of people to talk about, because there is this perception that that's sort of indirectly what you're trying to promote. And again, with us, like it definitely isn't, it's never been. But I can certainly understand why people have that concern. So yeah, but I would say Mari's point is right. If all you ever hear is that it's something that only does happen to women, it's just going to keep the male side of the story buried, because I mean, this is a line Christine has in the play, but what self-respecting man is going to come out and identify as having something that's commonly regarded as a woman's problem, or is even going to think that what they're experiencing is abuse, if all they've been told is that it never happens to men. So yeah, it's a really difficult one to untangle.
Yeah. So Kathy, thanks, Michael. That's really kind of explains quite a lot there in terms of the thinking in the background and the complexity of the conversation, I guess. And when you were doing your presentation, you referred to women who are the victims of domestic abuse by other women as well. And as you say, it'll be talked about and understood even less possibly. And one thing that struck me from your presentation was the statistic that only about 20% of male victims of abuse go on to report what's happened. So I think I did a kind of mental calculation. By your sort of stats, around about 3 million men, just short of 3 million male victims of domestic abuse, are being quiet about what's happening. I'm not sure what the statistics are in terms of female victims, but I imagine that's quite ignorant of me, but I imagine that there's a large proportion of female victims who also don't report what's happened to them, which is, again, in terms of the whole conversation, a big issue, a big concern. Kathy's asked, do you have any suggestions about how to start a conversation with someone you believe may be in an abusive relationship? And is there any difference between how you would approach this with a man as opposed to how you might approach this with a woman? So how do you start that really tricky conversation if you think maybe something's going on?
I mean, I would preface my answer just by saying I'm not, and I've never been a domestic abuse support worker. And if there's others on the call who are, they'd probably be able to offer more insight into that than I could. I think maybe just in terms of the conversations that I did have in the course of researching the play, I think what I found with men was that if they would very rarely sort of say, I'm being abused, or, all this stuff is happening and I'm really upset and I want to relieve the relationship. What would usually happen is that they would just describe things that they might be struggling with in a very sort of indirect way, and you would start to see red flags. And it would be, I have to ask permission before I go out, or it would be, that their bank accounts are being checked on a regular basis, or sort of very high levels of jealousy, or a certain amount of let's call it online surveillance, checking their phones, checking their messaging services and stuff like that. I never, when anyone sort of said that to me, threw the word abuse into the conversation, just because I didn't think it would be particularly helpful in the first instance. I thought people would just instantly sort of back off. What I generally tended to do was just to say something along the lines of, I've spoken to someone else who had a similar situation, and this is kind of where it ended up. How do you feel hearing that? Is that a route that you could see yourself going down? And try to sort of do it that way. there's other women I've spoken to as well who've talked about things that have been equally concerning. I think I would have had, and I had less hesitation about using words like coercive control or abuse in those circumstances, just because it wasn't as much of a mental leap for the people I was speaking to assume that that label could be applicable to their situation. Yeah, that would be my answer to that. Vicky's got her hand up, and I think probably could answer this question a lot better.
So yeah, there's a few people that want to ask questions, so we'll make sure everybody gets to ask their questions. So yeah, again, thanks for that, Michael. I suppose reflecting on what you've just said there, it sounds to me, and it probably seems like an obvious thing to say, but in the same way that there's now a lot of training for people that work within our services, our broad services, to, for example, start a conversation with someone who maybe they think is having suicidal thoughts, for instance, a very difficult conversation to start. There's a lot more awareness and training about how to begin that conversation. It sounds as though there needs to be something just as focused and as high profile as that in relation to domestic abuse. It's not just about how you would ask a man, but how you would ask a woman, particularly if someone isn't admitting it to themselves. You know, a really difficult thing to think about, and really it's probably a kind of workforce development initiative that really needs to have the profile raised. So just before we get into the questions, Maureen has commented that she likes that the female partner in the play is depicted as a complicated person with her own difficult past and baggage. Quite often it's easy to think as perpetrators as purely bad, but abuse is so complex, and so are the reasons it happens. And I think that probably resonates with all of us here who've worked in children and family and wider services over our professional careers. And the word that I noted down from Maureen's comment was demonize. The cases that you mentioned, the Sarah Everard case and others, I suppose the most extreme circumstances, we can be at risk of demonizing perpetrators, dehumanizing them, which is a really dangerous thing to do. I suppose, and that any perpetrator is, after all, a human being, is a person.
Yeah.
They aren't necessarily a good or a bad person, but there's complexities there, and I think you related that in terms of when you mentioned how the Christine's father in the play himself had been abused, and there was that kind of cycle of abuse. So I suppose the word kind of coming to mind beyond demonization is kind of, it's a difficult thing to have, but empathy around this entire conversation too, which is a really hard thing to talk about, but it's probably quite important if we want to really get into the kind of breaking this cycle, I suppose.
I was going to say that to my mind was probably the biggest ethical choice I had to make when I was writing the script, because just to turn it on its head, if I'd been writing about a female victim and I had been portraying a male abuser, I would have experienced extreme discomfort, to put it mildly, if I spent half of the play talking about why the guy was knocking the shit out of her. You know, and it's not a difficult one to understand. You know, if you looked at, I don't know, Mike Tyson, for argument's sake, no one's going to watch a half-hour documentary about why he did what he did. Rightly so, I would say. And I think the other risk as well is that if you look at why someone does something, you can start to stray into dangerous territory, because I think one of the reasons a lot of victims stay in abusive relationships is because they empathize too much. They can see why someone's doing something and they accept that as justifications for why they're doing it. And they're like, oh, well, they're only doing this because X, ergo I'm going to stay. And I really had a concern that if I went too far down that route with Scarlett's character, then I would inadvertently be sending that message to victims who were listening, you know, oh, well, you know, if your partner's threatening suicide, of course you have to stay, because if you leave, they're going to kill themselves, and that's awful. And I really didn't want to do that. But on the flip side, I felt it was really important to show the technique, the manipulation and what that looks like, because I think it's impossible for someone outside of an abusive relationship to understand why people stay in abusive relationships without seeing how they're being convinced to stay in them. And it's an interesting one as well, because I've spoken to lots of different abuse services, And some will take the view that abuse is abuse, and it doesn't matter why it's being done, it's wrong, and the right thing to do is to leave that relationship, which I absolutely subscribe to personally. That said, like, I do think people need to understand the fact that abusers will have had things that have led them to that way of behavior that need to be addressed, because if you're looking at say Alex and Scarlett's story, Alex could absolutely leave that relationship and he'd arguably be safe from Scarlett then, but that doesn't then negate the risk of Scarlett going on to abuse someone else in turn. So you need to have some support out there, I would say, for perpetrators as well as for victims, because without that, you're not going to break that cycle of abuse. And you know what I mean, just having that sort of hard line, you know, you just need to get away from them and they're wrong, that's not really going to work for the general public in the long run, because you're not actually stopping that behavioral pattern from playing out again. So yeah, that was a really difficult line to tread, I would say.
Yeah. Okay, so 3 people would like to ask a question, so we'll get through you all. Lord, Vicky and Maureen have all got their hands up really, so Vicky, if you would like to ask your question first, and then we'll ask Lord and then Maureen. I think that was the order anyway, I'm not sure.
I do believe Lord was first, so if you want to go first, I don't mind waiting.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay, Lord, if you want to ask your question first then, no problem.
Oh, thank you. I guess in terms of, you know, thinking about men's rights or fathers' rights, as Michael didn't necessarily sort of want to lean on necessarily, but from sort of the guys that we talk to, from the things that we write about in Mandad magazine, we see all too often that guys are screwed basically by the family courts and by the various systems that exist, including, you know, child maintenance, social services, and so on. So I think, you know, there's an issue with not just recognizing domestic abuse and violence, but actually there's a massive reason why guys don't speak out, why they don't leave relationships, because they are terrified of being cut out of their children's lives. And I'm just wondering, I don't know what the answer is, but in order for dads to feel like they can step out of relationships and not lose everything, you know, we need to get to a point where there is a real balance, and where men feel, yeah, safe to leave the family home with their children, to involve the police if necessary, if they are the ones being abused, and protecting the kids in the process. There's so many issues. It's so complex in terms of why guys won't speak out in the first place. And I'm just wondering, Michael, what your view or experience might be in relation to that, really, and, you know, any of the guys that you've spoken to along the way.
That was definitely a huge theme through, I would say, probably roughly half of the guys I spoke to. They, generally speaking, I would say they kind of fell into one of 2 categories, which they'd either been in an abusive relationship, they'd moved through it, and they were dealing with the fallout, or they were at the early stages of a relationship where stuff was happening and they weren't entirely sure what it was, but they, to a degree, knew that they weren't cool with what was happening. The guys in that former camp, like, a lot of them had experienced what you talked about. Either they'd stayed for a long time because they were worried that if they left, they would lose access to their children, or they had lost access to their children. I didn't sort of go too much into it in the segments I played, but the character of Jason, that's his story arc, and you find out about the impact his experiences had on his relationship with his child. I think the comments you've made are fair. Like, I don't think the family courts are necessarily that favourable to men. I think possibly they might have seen a lot of negative scenarios that have come across their courtrooms that possibly have given them a reason to have a prejudice against men. So I wouldn't, you know, I'm not sort of having a punt at them. And likewise, I would say I've known an awful lot of women who've had awful experiences of the family court system too, not necessarily in relation to male partners, but certainly in relation to family members. I think the answer, like you say, is around awareness raising. One of the most horrific things I heard, there was a documentary called Abused by My Girlfriend by a guy called Alex Skill that came out a couple of years ago. And he talks in that about, just people not getting it, going to hospital, police talking to him, and just people not putting two and two together because they just don't have the perception that a guy can experience these things. And I think the answer is awareness raising. I think the more things there are out there, whether it's the radio drama, Alex's documentary, mainstream media, like that's fundamentally the key. I don't think it's anything that's going to change overnight, but I think it is changeable in the long run. And just to clarify as well, when I talked about men's rights earlier, I would like to draw that distinction between groups that are campaigning for access to children and fathers' rights versus like MRAs, as I would say, which I generally would say are sort of more American based. I wouldn't equate the two, and it's the latter I would say that possibly don't always help the argument for men's rights.
Okay, great, thanks, Michael. Okay, so Vicky.
So hi, sorry to jump in. It wasn't more of a question. It was more of along the lines of what Kathy was asking about having these difficult conversations. And I think it doesn't matter if you're a male or female, if you're an abuser, you would approach it in the same manner, as long as they trust you to open up and have that safe space to do so, and have that trust and not victim blaming or shaming. There's no reason that the conversations wouldn't flow in kind of the same dynamics. Although it would probably be more difficult for a man to disclose to me due to my job role. Maybe let's say it's seen as a feminist organization who obviously supports women in domestic abuse. But what I found in my role as a survivor engagement officer, I work with a lot of women across Wales who are survivors, and there's this empathy about it happens to men too, and women on women, and it's about, in our work, we raise that awareness too. We work with, I'm sure you're aware of some of the organisations that Respect Safe Lives, who have survivors of domestic abuse that are male. They have the perpetrator program, so it's about feeding in, aligning our work and how we can feed into everybody's work and kind of create those partnerships to make it safer, so that we're campaigning for what's right, not the fact that it's female on female or male on female. Yes, the statistics show it's predominantly male that's perpetrators, but is that because men are too scared to come out? Is it because there's lack of services? Is it lack of kind of the empathy that maybe there's more awareness because more women speak out? And I guess that's what the survivors talk about a lot is how can we, in the strategic plans and the policy that we shape with organisations and services in Wales, how can we align partnerships to create that awareness too? We're not against that it doesn't happen to men. It's just, how do we get men to speak out and find that they have that safe space, and then the interventions and support that's necessary for them to carry that through. Sorry, there was lots of conversations that went on. But family courts, yes, we have the same issues. Where children are being ripped from mothers for no fault of their own, whether that's where they are in their roles, because some of the perpetrators that I'm aware of have quite effective roles and have that kind of control to kind of instigate and control the situation a lot more than, I don't know, say someone who doesn't have money and doesn't work. So I feel everybody's, what everybody's saying, and from that perspective, just because I represent I think there's about 85 women in the network, that there's just as many friends who have reached out because of my role. And I think it's just having that safe space and being believed and not judged, watching the use of language that we use when we're having these conversations, but also, where does this fit within your role? What partnerships can you create within your role with other organisations to kind of demonstrate your awareness, and how we put that together and align it more? So, I'm sorry, it's not a question, but I just thought if I could just help, I would have the same conversation with a male survivor in that safe space if they trusted me enough to come forward with that. I think there's about 18 men I confer with, when we're looking at strategic policy or anything to do with the policing. Family courts is a huge issue. Why it's closed, we're trying to campaign for it to be open, so that there's less that can be covered up. But I think that's more of an ingrained systemic failing rather than what people believe. They go by the book, and I think every case has to be dealt with on a one-to-one case, not it doesn't fit this box, it doesn't fit this box, so we'll just put it in anyway. But yeah, I hope that helps. But I'm willing to network with anybody to kind of establish what you do and how you go about your work to kind of align it with what I do. So
thanks very much, Vicky. I think that's really helpful, just describing how your service and your colleagues in your area have tried to address this really complex issue. And that's a kind offer there to connect with anyone. Vicky, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but maybe if you were okay with it, we could always share your contact details or something if people wanted to ask you any further questions or hear a bit more about how you actually address some of these really complex issues. And I think what I've kind of picked up from what you were saying there is that, I guess, essentially this is really trying to focus on the individual, isn't it, in each individual circumstance, which is a lot easier said than done. Okay, so we've only got a few minutes left, but Maureen had her hand up, her hand's down now. I don't know if you still want to ask your question, Maureen.
No, it's okay. It was just in relation to the message I'd sent anyway, so it's all good.
Okay, thanks, Maureen, and thanks for your comments in the chat box. They've been really helpful as well. And Vicky, thanks. So Vicky from Lang from Welsh Women's Aid Vicky shared her email address in the chat box there. Yeah, anybody wants to have a further conversation, that's great. So we've only got a few minutes left. I wonder if anybody had any further questions they would like to ask Michael, or any other comments you would like to make, or anything you would like to share before we sign off in a few minutes.
I've got one more question, Michael. Just I was interested in the figures that you, or the sort of evidence base, and I was just wondering where we could access it. Is that freely available somewhere?
Yeah,
or
if you go on to there's an organisation called Mankind Initiative. If you go onto their website, there's a section that's specifically devoted to reports, statistic runs, and you can find the police and crime reporting statistics on there.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think as Vicky alluded to as well, there's always stories behind data, and if it looks like there aren't that many men reporting, or that there's higher levels of women than there are of men, that is a natural question to ask. Is that because there aren't as many male victims, or is that because they're not reporting? So they are reporting statistics as opposed to incident statistics. But yeah, they're all out there, and yeah, there's nothing we put in the play that that can't be verified. I certainly wouldn't want anyone to think that it was in any way a sort of like polemic or anything.
Thanks, Michael. And Vicky's just put in the comment section as well that the stats can also be found on the Respect website and Safe Lives as well. Lord is asking if we're going to share the recording yet. We put all these recordings up on YouTube. You can access them through our website. I don't think it'll be the conversation, but it'll be Michael's talk. Just because we sort of said, at the start, we want people to feel free to ask questions and converse without worrying about, thinking about other people kind of viewing what we're talking about, and maybe gives people the freedom to ask maybe some more sensitive questions. And a lot of really positive feedback in the comment section. So that's great. So listen, we've only got a minute or so to go. So I'm just going to say thank you for Michael for coming along and telling us about this work. It's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, I guess, but already from the questions in the conversation, it seems as though people it's really sparked some important questions, and a lot of questions that are probably not answered or even necessarily answerable right here and now. So there's clearly a lot more work to be done on this wider issue of domestic abuse in general, awareness raising, destigmatizing, encouraging people to understand how to support and engage those who may be concerned about, and how those who are victims are helped to kind of recognize the fact that that's what's happening to them and where they might get that support, how they might start that conversation. Michael's shared his contact details on
just in
chat box as well. Lord has put up his, and we'll share all these contacts with everybody. So Lord has put up from Man Dad magazine the online connection there for that. So that's just come to the end of the session. As ever, I would, Kathy, if you have the connection for the evaluation, I'm not sure. Before you log off, if you don't mind clicking onto the Wufoo link that I think Kathy's just about, there it is, just to let us know what you thought of the session. And really, I think what's really important about the Wufoo questionnaire that will take you no more than a minute or two to fill in is that we'd like to hear from you and from others. Who would you really like to or what would you really like to hear more about? Is there anything from today that you would like to go into in a bit more depth? Would you like us to reach out and invite anyone to talk about anything in particular? Or indeed, would you like to come along to one of these sessions and talk to colleagues across the UK and wider? We've had people from all over the world log into these sessions in the past. Tell them a bit about a piece of work that you're involved in or that you're interested in, just to generate this conversation and hopefully take things forward. So, yeah, so that's us. We've managed to overreach ourselves by 1 minute, which is not too bad at all. So thanks very much, everybody. We'll share all these links with you, and hopefully we'll see all of you again in a couple of weeks' time when we will be talking about, and that's when I stop talking, Kathy, because you know what I'm talking about, I don't.
We've got someone from Shared Parenting Scotland coming on, and they're going to be talking about new training. They've got an e-learning package of training to help parents who are going through separation and how best to co-parent in those situations. So it's basically it's a new product that they've got coming out. So they're just explaining what it is and how it can help parents. So it's a product aimed at parents, I believe.
And probably a very good, a very fortunate sort of dovetailing there. Shared Parenting Scotland used to be called Families Need Fathers, and they were set up in Scotland to support men, fathers who'd been separated from their partners and were struggling with access to their children. A couple of years ago, they, I guess, responded to some of the kind of things that we were talking about here today. Let's not focus on whether this is about men or whether this is about women who are struggling from this issue. Let's support any individual who's suffering from this separation and maybe what it means for them in their relationship with their children. So they're now called Shared Parenting Scotland, and they will tell you in a couple of weeks about how they are now supporting lots of men and lots of women. They're supporting any parent who finds themselves in that situation. They've been inundated during COVID with women, not just men, who are going through these similar issues. So a good example of how an organisation has evolved, I suppose, to look at the broader issue. A really good example of that. So I encourage you to come along. They're a great organisation in a couple of weeks' time. So yeah, that's us. Thanks very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day and hope you have a nice weekend wherever you are.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.